We are very happy today to have Jamie Metzl with us. He is a technology and healthcare futurist, a geopolitical expert, a novelist, an entrepreneur, a media commentator, and a senior fellow of the Atlantic Council. In February 2019, he was appointed to the World Health Organization Expert Advisory Committee on developing global standards for the governance and oversight of human genome editing. He has previously served in the US National Security Council, State Department, Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and as a human rights officer for the United Nations in Cambodia. He is a former partner of a New York-based global investment firm and serves on the advisory council to Walmart's Future of Retail Policy Lab, and is a faculty member for Singularity University's Exponential Medicine Conference. Was chief strategy officer for a biotechnology company, and ran unsuccessfully for the US House of Representatives for Missouri's 5th Congressional District in Kansas in 2004. He has served as an election monitor in Afghanistan and the Philippines, advised the government of North Korea on the establishment of special economic zones, and is the Honorary Ambassador to North America of the Korean Ministry of Trade, Industry, and Energy. I am going to stop. Well, actually, we do have more. He publishes widely and is also the author of A History of the Cambodian Genocide, the historical novel The Depths of the Sea, and the genetics thrillers Genesis Code and Eternal Sonata. His nonfiction book, Hacking Darwin, Genetic Engineering and the Future of Humanity can be purchased now. There's a link on the website. So in short, I think he is a person who has a very rare combination of expertise. And so we are very, very lucky to hear from him today on the topic of coronavirus broke the world and what comes next. So we will probably be doing a series of what comes next conference calls, virtual briefings, so please stay tuned. Before I turn it over to Jamie, just a reminder to everyone that you can ask questions in the Q&A box. You can also email Brian at bthang@network2020.org, and we will get to questions after Jamie stops speaking. So with that, Jamie, thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Courtney, and I'm happy to be back with the Network 2020 community at scary times like these kinds of networks of people coming together to just understand the world that we're facing are now really more important than ever before. And none of us, no matter who we are, where we are, can really fathom this full story alone. And so we need each other. And so I'm really thrilled to be back with your group. So thank you for having me. And thanks everybody. I know when I was younger, I remember when we had this video game Pong in the basement, and I'm sure are all too young to remember this, but there were two little handles, and there was a little digital ball, and it went back and forth, and you had to move the handle to hit the ball, and it was the greatest thing ever. And then now we have all these super fancy video games, Grand Theft Auto, and whatever the young people are doing these days. And we're in the Pong phase of this virtualization of our lives and all this underlying technology. And so I'm on all of these meetings, like everybody is, all day and all night. And it's always this kind of awkward beginning, and you see people kind of leaning forward, and you see their finger typing, and we're going to get a lot better systems for this. And maybe that's part of the theme here, is that there were all kinds of trends that were happening anyway. Virtualization, changes in the way we do healthcare, changes in the way communities form, activism happens, all sorts of things. And what we're experiencing now is basically the future is coming crashing into the present. Trends that may have taken 10 or 20 years to be realized are now happening in just months. And it's a really fundamental and profound change. And I say this all the time, that there are people who are feeling this is kind of like a winter storm, or a really bad storm, where there's a storm, you kind of stay home for a while, the plows come out, they plow away the snow, the sun comes out, it melts the snow, and then we just go back to our lives as if it never happened. And if you can take away one thing from this talk, it's this: the old world that we had before this crisis is not coming back, at least not in the form that it was. And if you're sitting around waiting for that life to come back, you're going to be waiting for the rest of your life. And you're going to become one of those old people wandering around reminding everybody that coffee used to cost a nickel. And so while we're in this moment and while we're figuring out where things are heading, this is the time when everybody at every level needs to be thinking about what's happening, what does it mean, what does it mean for me, how can I contribute to this change and positive change, and where do I see myself in the future? Because if you're just waiting for your old life to come back as it was, it's never, ever coming back. This is one of those fundamentally transformative moments in life. And we all, in my view, have to see that. So let me, with that as an introduction, I know I'm not supposed to touch my face, but I did it anyway. Let me go back and start from the beginning. Everybody knows that we're experiencing a health crisis. But at its core, what we're experiencing is a governance crisis. So if we didn't have a governance crisis, we wouldn't have this health crisis. Why is it a governance crisis? Well, let's take it step by step. First, when there was the first outbreak in China, with all of its experience of SARS and MERS, and recognizing that China is really the incubator of so many of these terrible, particularly zoonotic and other viruses, China could have totally dealt with this in the beginning. And not only that, they had set up a whole infrastructure to do so. And that infrastructure spectacularly failed. And we have to recognize that every person who dies of this disease is dying because of China's failure. Not because of China's intention, not because they didn't set up a national surveillance system, they did, but because for political reasons that were maybe not even intentional in this case, but which were inherent to China's political form of organization, the authorities on the ground in China in the critical first few weeks of this crisis prioritized suppressing news of what was happening for their own political reasons, which can only be understood in the context of the pathologies, excuse me, of the Chinese system. So it was a political issue. And not only that, it was 42 days before the virus was, from when the virus was identified to when the World Health Organization experts were allowed in. They disinfected their market before testing the animals and the people. And again, a massive, dangerous, deadly cover-up in those first few weeks. We would have had so much more information had this been done properly. Then, after the first few weeks, China switched course. It kicked into gear, and it had a massive response that not only saved a lot of people's lives in China, they bought time for the rest of the world, because the call went out in January. I called this in January. US intelligence called this in January. And the countries that recognize the severity, whether it's Korea, Taiwan, or others, they got rolling in January. The United States did not. It was a fundamental political failure of the United States. And people, I'm here in New York, I imagine many people on this call are, we are dying because of the failure of China and because of the fundamental failure of the United States. The CDC failed to have adequate testing. There were other countries like Korea, like Germany, that rose to this challenge. We fundamentally failed. And the President of the United States, for political reasons, possessing the intelligence reports about the severity of what was happening and the risk, for political reasons, chose to knowingly lie to the American people. And not only that, then when we had this whole song and dance about we were going to shut down the borders and that saved us, the virus was already here. And the borders we shut, the genetic testing is now showing, didn't even have anything to do with the spread of the virus, at that point at least, because the cases of COVID that we have here are ones that largely came from Europe, went from China to Europe, and then from Europe to here. So it was just a fundamental failure. And then, because of the pathologies of our system, we had a series of governors and mayors and others who were looking to President Trump for their cues. And because the cues were so fundamentally wrong, there are thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of people who will be dead as a result of Donald Trump and his administration's behavior. This is not a time for divisiveness. We have to come together to solve problems, yes, but we can't lie to ourselves about the essential nature of this problem. And there's a third issue. I was on CNN last night, and I'm a expert advisor, as Courtney said, to the World Health Organization. As a matter of fact, I jumped off of my call with our WHO committee to join you here now. And the World Health Organization also failed. And let's talk about why the WHO failed. The WHO was created in 1948 and with a really important mission. If you ask anybody on earth, should we have an empowered, resourced WHO that can have a global surveillance system, that can recognize where there are outbreaks and send emergency teams to go there immediately and work with local officials to stop it in its tracks? Everybody on earth, especially now, would say yes. So why don't we have that? One, because we have our world of states, and the states aren't willing to give the international organizations created and funded by those states the authority to at least do a better job of helping solve these problems, not just deadly pathogens, WMD, climate change, all of the existential threats that we're facing. We have the same problem. And then we have a politicization of our international spaces. There is not the slight, I'm not a fan of President Trump's critique of the WHO, but there's no doubt in my mind that the WHO has been politicized. And if you want any evidence of that, just look at how Taiwan is treated in the WHO. China has blocked Taiwan's full participation in the WHO. People are dead because of that. And there's no doubt I know Dr. Tedros, he is incredible, and the WHO is doing really fantastic work now. But there is no doubt in my mind that if this outbreak had happened in some poor, weak African country, the WHO emergency response team would have been right there in a matter of hours. It wouldn't have been delayed by 42 days. The only reason it was delayed by 42 days is everybody, including the WHO, was tiptoeing around China. And while China was doing this cover-up, I mean, people say it's trying to save face, but it was, while China was, one, doing the cover-up, and then two, compensating for the total screw-up in the first few weeks with a massive response that was in China's interest and in the world's interest, the WHO wasn't allowed to get in. So why don't we have a WHO that is resourced and empowered and has the mandate to do its job? That's shame on all of us for letting that happen. And we could be having this exact same conversation if not just if there was a pandemic, but let's just say there was a nuclear weapon or a dirty bomb that went off. Let's call it Washington, London, Moscow, and Beijing all on the same day. We'd be having this exact same conversation saying everybody knew about nuclear weapons. Everybody knew about proliferation. Why didn't we do anything? We could have the exact same conversation if someday our oceans hit a tipping point and become less able to sustain the ocean life that we all depend on for our survival. And we'd say, well, we had all the clues, all the information, we could roll out the reports that others have written, and we'd say, yeah, well, why didn't we do anything? So now is the moment when we're not doing something, and that has to be the charge of this moment. We have to get through the problems that we face, you know, the ones that are right in front of us. But if we just fix this problem and go back to the world that we had, we'll be right back here. It could be, we did a big book launch event for Hacking Darwin just 2 days ago, and George Church, the world's greatest geneticist, he was saying there could be another one of these that could be worse. And not only that, that worse one could happen while we're still responding to this one, because the rate of deadly pathogens is increasing because of climate change, human population expansion, destruction of natural habitats, and all the things that people know. So this is a political issue at its core with other manifestations. So now let me just say a few words about how I see things playing out. As I said, I see this as a governance crisis that morphed into a health crisis. And now the health crisis is morphing into an economic crisis. And we have 18 million new unemployed here in the United States, massive return to poverty throughout the developing world. And this crisis is going to really grow and expand, in my view. And the reason is because I don't think life normalizes, even though I've said before it's not going to go back to how it was, but normalizes comes to anything that feels like normal, not just until there's a vaccine, but until there's a vaccine that's widely distributed around the entire planet. And, let's be optimistic, 18 months, 2 years. So I talked about that we're in the Pong phase of video conferencing. We're going to be living some version of this life. That doesn't mean full lockdown, but some version of this. And there'll be moments of easing up. And then the more we ease up, it'll come back, and then we'll have to do this again. But we're going to be, it's going to be back and forth, maybe 18 months, maybe 2 years, maybe 3 years. So these lives, these can't be facsimiles of our old lives. We're building new lives connected to our old lives. We're building new lives in these new spaces with these new norms. And that's, I think, a really, really important point for us to take in. But just as this didn't end as a governance crisis, it became a health crisis, it became an economic crisis, then it's going to become a series, and it's already becoming a series of political government crises around the world. That's so funny. I said series, and my iPhone thought I said Siri, and it made a little beep. So apologies for that. A series of political crises around the world. We've already seen it in Kosovo, where the government fell. We've already seen it in Hungary, where there's basically a soft coup by the government. And we'll see what happens here in the United States. I mean, if you are Russia and you got away with basically attacking the United States in the 2016 elections, and you see the United States totally on its knees as a result of a monumental, historic level government screw up, and an inability by the US government, particularly the administration, to fix this problem, now is a perfect time to act. And so I absolutely anticipate major attacks on the US election process. And that because we're so divided, and you only have to look at what just happened in Wisconsin, and because we're going to have not enough poll workers, we're going to have a transition to electronic and mail-in voting. We're going to have two political parties with different views on how things should play out. We're going to have the Republican Party strategy. One of its key strategies has been voter suppression through redistricting, and Democrats have also done, to a lesser extent, redistricting, and denying access to voting, whether it's through the modern equivalent of poll taxes or disenfranchising former felons and things like that. So we are going to see, our elections are going to be extremely contentious, and it's not just going to be here. We're going to see, we already see borders going up inside the EU. We don't know whether the EU is going to make it through this crisis. When in the summer, the brunt of this crisis could easily shift from the northern to southern hemispheres. which are less prepared to handle this? Could there be massive migration, refugee flows of people who are just terrified? What would be the implications of that? How does that change national politics? We don't know, but we certainly know that there is a huge amount of tumult coming, and it is going to have massive political effects. And over time, and time again, because all of history is speeding up and compressed, over time, meaning this year, we're going to see huge geopolitical shifts. In the beginning and the end of 1956, the United Kingdom had the same number of soldiers, same number of boats, same number of weapons, and roughly the same GDP. But in the beginning of 1956, the UK was a global power. And at the end of 1956, the UK was a regional power. If trends continue and the United States looks as weak as we do today, with such a monumental absence of leadership, and China is able to get through this, get its economy going, keep some semblance of order, this shift that has been slowly happening is going to quickly happen. And I think the Chinese government recognizes that this is their moment. We're already seeing that in their propaganda efforts, but it's going to get, if they think they can get away with it, and they made a big mistake in 2008, thinking that was the moment where they could flip the global power structure. The US rallied, and that hasn't fully happened. But I guarantee that we're going to see that kind of movement, both from China and Russia, and then maybe from some smaller actors over the course of the year, because this is a plastic moment in international affairs, and things are changing, and the world that we thought we knew is very different from the world that we are emerging into. And I think that's just a really, really important fundamental point. And let me just close with where I began. And that is, we are all coming together in new ways, even with these clunky interfaces like Zoom 1.0. It'll get better and better. But I think what we're all experiencing is that there are new forms of community that are being created around us. I was feeling so angry and upset a few weeks ago that we have this total mismatch between the global nature of the problems that we face as humans and the way that we're organized to face them through states and the international organizations created and controlled by states. I stayed up all night and I drafted a declaration of global interdependence, which I then just didn't know what to do with it. So I put it up on my website on jamiemetzl.com in my blog. And then I sent it around to just the people on my personal email list. And I was just overwhelmed by this response that came back to that. And I'd given a talk also at Singularity University, and the video of that went viral. And so then it was clear that something really big was happening, that people around the world were recognizing that we couldn't solve the problems with the institutions and norms that we had and even have now alone. And so through that process, the first thing I just said, all right, just like this, let's organize a Zoom call. We had 130 people from 23 states 23 countries on 5 continents. And then we had this really intense call that we broke into 8 working groups that are now meeting very intensely. Everybody from this beginning group is reaching out, recruiting others, and you can feel a movement growing that I don't think could have happened. I know it couldn't not have happened just a few short months ago. So we are organizing, not we, just our one group. Everybody is organizing. And just like the virus doesn't recognize national boundaries, these new forms of organization also is transcending boundaries. That doesn't mean we don't live in countries We do. That doesn't mean we don't need our states to succeed. We need them to succeed now more than ever. We need the United Nations now more than ever, including an empowered and enhanced and depoliticized World Health Organization. And World Health Organization is a fantastic organization. I'm so honored to be associated with it. But we all have to do better. But as we mourn our losses, and we must, and I'm here in New York, and I just look out my window, and the streets are relatively clear, but there are ambulances, and these ambulances are a reminder of what we've lost. But something new and really exciting is being created. Our world is being reformed, and we all need to be part of that process. And a lot of people say, well, this feels like 2001. And what I always say, my view, is that this isn't really like 2001. This is more like 1941, when there's a major crisis. We don't even know whether we can overcome the crisis, just like FDR and Churchill didn't know that in 1941. But just like in 1941, when FDR declared the Four Freedoms, and FDR, Churchill, and others announced the Atlantic Charter, which were the North Star toward which we were fighting, the values that we wanted to guide not just the struggle, but the world that would be created after the struggle, was one. We now need to be articulating those principles. And I wish we had an FDR. I wish we had a Winston Churchill, but I think most people would agree that we don't. But through forums like this and these new forms of organization, what we can do, at very least, is distribute that job among all of us. Everybody is a little piece of FDR, a little piece of Winston Churchill. And that's why this is an all hands on moment, all hands on deck moment for all of us as humans. If you are sitting home, binge watching Netflix, get off your couch, because your country and your world and your family and your community need you. And this is our moment. We have to do it, and we have to come together, and we have to do it as groups like this and many others. So let me stop there, and I very much look forward to hearing your thoughts and answering any questions you may have.
All right, terrific. Thank you, Jamie. It's actually wonderful to hear sort of an uplifting and positive transformative message, because I think a lot of what we have is gloom and doom. So just as a reminder to everyone who's watching and listening, if you'd like to ask a question, you can do so in the Q&A box, or email Brian at bthang@network2020.org. Before I turn to the Q&A box, I wanted to ask my own question and just get your thoughts on you mentioned how it's almost like the future is coming crashing in. And I remember when I was in grad school studying international relations, there are several schools of thought, and there's the old school realist school of thought, and then there's the internationalist school of thought, which almost seemed to be the more forward thinking one. And one would assume that in a situation that requires a lot of global connectivity to solve, that the internationalist, sort of that future looking one, would win out. And yet at the same time, you have scholars like Danny Roderick at Harvard who are saying that this might just exacerbate trends like populism and sort of the revanchism that we're already seeing. We just had a call the other week with Arthur Krober, who is saying that, in terms of the US-China relationship, something like this might further that rift. So how do you respond to thinkers like that?
Yeah, it's a really important question. Decades ago, Benjamin Barber had a wonderful book, Jihad versus McWorld, that also dealt with this issue, because I think all of us are experiencing these two poles. On one hand, we have this virus that is not discriminating against people, certainly based on our countries. And that means that if we want to fight this virus, we need to have a collective response. At the same time, we have all of this populism and nationalism, and we have all these walls and boundaries and borders that are going up. And there will be countries, outlier countries, like New Zealand, that can say, all right, we are an isolated, faraway country. We're just going to shut down everything. We're going to eliminate this virus, isolate it, and then we're going to just live our lives and cook our sheep and do whatever we do until this passes. But most everybody else, if you're living certainly on a big continent like the United States, if you're connected to others in any way, this virus is passing. And so when we build up these walls, it's like the cities that built the big walls in the Middle Ages. They worked for keeping out one type of invaders, but when the Black Death arrived, the worst place you could be would be inside of one of those very crowded and dirty medieval cities. So we need to recognize that we're in this together, as I mentioned in my talk. But we also need to recognize that this is a moment of great fear for everybody. And at these moments, there are opportunists who recognize that people will gravitate toward confidence, and they'll gravitate toward what they perceive as strength. And so the regular rules of politics aren't suspended. It's not for the exact same reasons that the world didn't embrace this globalist vision kind of ever. It will not do so now. But I think that what we have to say, and the argument, and I hope it will win, and I hope it can win, is that this recognition that we're all connected isn't some kind of kumbaya. It is the most hard-nosed, realpolitik approach to addressing the challenges we face. And we can't address these challenges if we stick to these narrow nationalist narratives, just like in the United States now, where states are erecting barriers between each other. But that doesn't make sense. We're seeing great examples here in New York, and we're getting ventilators sent from other states, and we'll send them our ventilators, and together we need to solve these problems. I'm not calling for abolishing the concept of countries. That's the way we've chosen to organize ourselves over hundreds of years, and we don't need to revolutionize the whole system. We have to recognize that we have big collective problems, and the only way we're going to address them successfully is together.
All right, thank you. All right, so I'm going to turn to the Q&A box. So our first question is, I'm curious on what your take is on why the US botched the testing so badly. Was it a red tape bureaucratic issue? Was it the CDC failing to adequately test the efficacy of its own diagnostic tests? And are there lessons learned that could be used to stave off another catastrophically slow response going forward?
It's a fantastic and a really important question. I don't know if I have a complete answer. And the CDC has done great work, does do great work, but they definitely screwed up in this case. So there will be an investigation. It's not going to happen now, but at some point. But here's my best guess of what happened here. First, inside of the CDC, which is really, it's the best CDC in my view in the world. But there was a screw up, and my guess is it probably had something to do with some kind of faulty system, just like when we had the Challenger crash. We had to look. There were a lot of things, and a lot of things that were working well, but there were some things that were not working well. Certainly, there has been a politicization, at least under this administration, of leadership of a lot of these types of organizations, not necessarily the CDC, and that could have been an issue. The US has had a kind of a bit of a go-it-alone strategy in public health, because for so many years, the standard in the United States has been better than the standard elsewhere. But it's almost like if you have a fire department and you start to not fund it fully, you start to not invest in the kind of training exercises, you let the culture to decay, you do all of these things, you don't even notice until there's a fire. But when there's a fire and the fire department isn't up to snuff, you find out the hard way. We've had a war on government and on civic culture in the United States at least since the days of Ronald Reagan. I mean, the whole slogan, government isn't the solution, government is the problem. I don't think libertarians are saying, well, yeah, just the government needs to get out of the way so each individual can solve the challenge of deadly global pathogens. We need our government. It needs to be efficient. It needs to work for the American people. But if we have a toxic civic culture that's denigrating and undermining our professional government officials, we are really, really in trouble. So that's number one. Number two is I'm a former National Security Council staff person. And so I know what it means to have White House leadership, because you have agencies and sometimes the White House needs to crack the whip, no matter how well-intentioned the agencies are. And under the Obama administration, now everybody knows this, we had an Office of Pandemic Preparedness, and those were the whip crackers. We eliminated that office. There wasn't really, Matt Pottinger is a friend and a great guy, and I think he will come out in history will show that he was one of the heroes working from the inside to try to make things work. But we just had a massive dysfunction in this White House. And in our system, presidential leadership really means a lot. When Donald Trump had the intelligence reports in January, he had come forward very publicly, and his administration, and said, this is serious. We get it. We're doing everything we can to fight. We would have had a much better situation. People criticize what happened to Obamacare with the rollout of the website. But what happened here is one of the greatest failures of government in all of American history. And so again, we're going to have to study this. We're going to have to get to the bottom of this. I don't have the answer, but those are at least two preliminary thoughts.
Sorry, just unmuting myself, and we're getting a bunch of questions in. So our next question is what, in your opinion, are the reasons that the US CDC did not accept the WHO COVID-19 test, which would have jump-started testing in the US?
I think we thought we could do better. I think we thought we could have a broader spectrum test. It's not that original WHO test that was also used in China and Korea was perfect. Had we had a better test, maybe we would have been better off. And that it was a risk that we took, good enough or state of the art. The United States, we are and have been the state of the art country. But that's the tragedy of this whole thing. I mean, we had all of the public health officials, most of the public health officials in the countries that are handling this well, like Korea and Taiwan, they trained here. The US was the gold standard for public health. Then we went to war with ourselves. And so we have undermined our capacity. Even if we're successful with all of the quarantining that we're doing now, we're not going to get the incidence of COVID-19 down to zero. We're then going to have a containment strategy that requires a public health infrastructure, but we hardly have that. And that's what happens. That's what happens when you have a war against your own civic culture. It's like an autoimmune response where the United States was eating its own political culture from within. And now we're really paying the price. And there were profiteers along the way who just had fun and made money pitting us against each other. And whether it's Fox News or the Russians or others, it was free for them. There was a benefit and no cost. And now we are suffering that cost. We, across the United States, are dying because of that cost.
It's a sobering thought. Our next question is, at this moment, we realize that strong governance is very important. The states must have the ability to battle this pandemic. However, the unintended consequence of more power for international organizations like the WHO could be the dependence of developing countries to these organizations. How do we avoid this?
So it's a really important question. It's a structural question. And we need to, on one hand, as I said before, we need to strengthen our international institutions. We need a stronger UN that's focusing not just on deadly pathogens, but on the broad spectrum of existential threats. But we also need to work to enhance the capacity of all countries to deal with these pathogens. We often have thought about helping disadvantaged countries, whether it's Africa or South Asia and elsewhere, as a form of charity. And this, Courtney, connects to the way I answered your question. It's not charity, maybe it's charitable, but it helps us. If Central African Republic has a working healthcare system, that helps the Central African Republic, but it helps us because these viruses need to incubate, and they have to incubate someplace. And so if we just took a step back, I mean, right now, the United States, just for the first 2 months, we spent $2 trillion. Maybe we'll spend 10, maybe we'll spend $15 trillion getting through this crisis. Maybe we'll turn ourselves into Venezuela over time. What percentage of that expenditure would have been required to help build working sanitation, water, healthcare systems in the poorest countries of the world? We could have built the equivalent of the Swiss healthcare system in every country in Africa for a fraction of what we're paying. We could have helped fund, and other countries, a World Health Organization that would really be empowered to have emergency response teams that would go anywhere, including China. And it was a political decision made on behalf of everybody to not have that World Health Organization. So absolutely, once we recognize that we're all in this together, we're going to have to look at systems around the world and think helping others isn't just charity. It's, well, maybe it's charitable, but it's in our selfish interest. And that's what we want. But we have to have that awareness so that we can have a politics that would support that.
Mm-hmm. Well, all ships rise on a rising tide, right? Okay, so the next question is, how can multilateral institutions balance global monitoring of health and security issues with privacy rights? For instance, Israel's decision to use phone surveillance to enforce coronavirus quarantines may have been effective, but it seems like a major invasion of privacy.
Yeah, and it's really important. I mentioned earlier about how we need to articulate our North Star. We need to know where we're going. What's the kind of society that we want to live in? And then use that framework to evaluate decisions that we're making now. And in times of crisis like this, we may not be able to have the same privacy rights as we would at normal times. Like for me, it's relevant. If there is somebody who I'm interacting with, let's say I'm invited at some normal time to a cocktail party, and then there's somebody there who has Ebola. We'll make it simple. Like, I have an interest in knowing that. And I don't think that person should have a privacy right to say, oh, well, we wouldn't want to infringe on your privacy, so you can go to this cocktail party. And I get that this is a caricaturish example. So we're going to have to make compromises, including on issues like privacy. And that's what's happening in Israel. That's certainly happening in Singapore, and to a massive extent, that's happening in China. But if we don't frame the decisions we may need to make now in the context of our overall goals, if we don't have sunset provisions that identify what is short-term and what's long-term, we won't get through. Once we get through this crisis, we'll have a political system that we won't be able to identify. And that is what happened in Hungary. And there was a moment of fear. Basically, they gave away their democracy with no endpoint in a moment of fear. We can't let that happen, but we also can't be purists about protecting every principle, including privacy, in its purest form, because there's some information that we need, and this is an emergency situation, and we're going to need to act fast, but we need to be as careful as we possibly can be.
I think that idea of sunset provisions is a very wise one. Our next question is, what advice would you give to former VP Joe Biden in regards to how he should handle the next half year, specifically hitting on the points of the need for leadership, his discourse to the American people while doing what I believe is the first virtual campaign, and the need to bridge divides even though he isn't actually holding office at the moment?
Yeah, it's a great question. As you may know, Joe Biden used to be my boss when I was deputy staff director of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He's a great guy. And here's what I believe is essentially two things. One, we need to do something that's a little bit unfamiliar in our system, but very familiar in the British political system. And that's in the UK, they have a shadow government where there's the party that's in power, and there's a shadow government that's not in power, but is out there and is making some very specific recommendations for what needs to be done. I think that Vice President Biden should very, very quickly set up almost not a government in exile that's undermining the legitimacy of the government, of the current government, but a shadow government that is meeting, that's making recommendations, that's doing press events, that is bringing together teams of experts and being constructive and helpful, and build a little thing. Maybe it's in the vice president's basement, but build something that looks like where a shadow government would be. Secondly, and I was just 2 days ago, I had a long conversation with Andrew Yang about this. The vice president, who is the best example of an old school retail politician. I've been in Delaware with then Senator Biden, and pretty much everybody in Delaware feels that they are best friends with Joe Biden. It's incredible to watch how warm those connections are. But politics has changed. It's changed along the way, starting with Howard Dean, certainly the Obama campaign. Andrew Yang perhaps has taken it to a new level. And we need to have those kinds of sensibility. Even Bernie Sanders has done a great job with building these kinds of networks. And that's the kind of campaign that Vice President Biden is going to need to run. It can't be just like this call. It can't be just a facsimile of the old thing in a new space. It has to be a semi-new thing and using the state-of-the-art new ideas. And I think both of those things are really important. And we're going to have a very, very, very contested election. I think it's going to be extremely ugly. But we need to start getting ready for that.
All right, thank you. Okay, our next question, and we have about 10 minutes left, so let's see if we can get through those that are remaining. So the next question is there any incentive for the actual administration to take positive steps towards this crisis? It seems that the administration is only profiting with this failure with welcoming Russian interference and voter suppression.
So in spite of how strong I was in my criticism of this administration, and I am vehement, and I feel very, very strongly that it's just been awful. I also think that at least in the last week or two, there have been some very encouraging signs of progress, beginning when President Trump recognized that there was a problem. It happened way, way, way too late. And so the government and the administration are starting to rally, and there are some good signs. We're ramping up production of necessary equipment. There's going to be funding for enhancing our public health capacities. All those things are really, really important. But the next thing that we need to do is we need to heal our civic culture. And it sounds so abstract and wishy-washy, but it's self-defeating to have the President of the United States doing these briefings every day and attacking the press. China kicked out the press, kicked out the American press, so they could do this cover-up. The last thing that we need is to waste 1 minute of our energy attacking ourselves. And President Trump and the administration have made some important steps, positive steps forward over these last couple of weeks. And I have confidence that some very good steps will be taken in the future. But now we need presidential leadership, and we need to heal our civic culture, and we need to get a little bit, I talked about everybody can be a little bit of FDR, but we need the President of the United States to be a little bit of FDR as well.
All right. Okay. Our next question is, do you believe the US needs something akin to the 9/11 Commission to examine our response to this health crisis? And do you think that would even be possible in this divided climate?
Yes, I absolutely do. And we have to look at everything. We have to look at the Chinese failure. We have to look at our failure. We have to look at what didn't work in the World Health Organization. I think it's absolutely critical. But I don't think we have to do it right now. Right now, we need to come together to get through this crisis, and we will get through this crisis. But then we need to take a very hard look at what happened, what were the problems, and how those problems can be fixed. But it's not just, as I said before, the problem of this deadly pathogen or all deadly pathogens. It's the problem of all of the existential threats to our country and our world. And we need to build institutions that can better protect that. I had a blog piece that I put out last week that talked about some of these issues. And what I said was, we need to have in our governments and in the United Nations a new agency that's looking at these existential threats, that's establishing priority areas that we're tracking, developing coordinated national and international action plans, and really make things happen. Because all too often we'll go through a crisis like this, we'll learn that one lesson, we'll fix something in that one area, but if we don't fix the superstructure, we're just going to be back here with another meeting talking about some other threat, and the essence of what we're saying is going to be exactly the same.
Okay. All right. There are remaining two questions, which I think we could probably get through and then be
Great.
right on time. Next one is, what role can the US and its alliances play to ensure that there is greater cooperation and a realistic vision on how to move forward?
Yeah, so we have to be using our alliances. That's one of the tragedies of this administration, is rather than seeing our allies as partners and friends and collaborators, we've all too often set them up as adversaries, even Canada. And so, as I said before, the only way we're getting through this crisis is together. So we need to be working together. And the United States and its allies, its treaty allies of Europe and Japan and Korea and Australia and Thailand and others, Philippines, it's a core group that needs to be articulating a vision, not just of our own alliance, but of how we as allies and friends, Canada, I should also mention, how we as allies and friends can help build a better world. And so we haven't seen that, but we need to see it.
All right, thank you. And just as a plug to everyone who's listening, we do have a call that will be upcoming. I don't know if we've set the date for it yet, but it's with Mira Rapp-Hooper, and she will be talking about China and also about alliances. So you can dig into that question a little bit more at a future date.
Mira is fantastic.
And our last question is, in the US, less affluent groups with more health issues are having much higher mortality than affluent groups who are healthier. What, if anything, do you see the US doing to address the needs of the less affluent groups who need much more in the way of healthcare services?
So during this crisis, we need to pay more attention to those communities. And we're already seeing that poor communities that tend to have higher levels of a lot of these different problems that are at least complicators and increase fatality rates for COVID-19 are being hit particularly hard, including the Black and Hispanic, Latino populations. And so we really need to right now funnel resources to those communities. But beyond that, beyond this crisis, it's the same interdependence point that I just made on the global scale. Beyond this crisis, we need to recognize that all of our health is connected. You could be the healthiest person in the world eating kale and quinoa every day and exercising and whatever. But if there is a pathogenic spread, you could get it if we don't have a working public health infrastructure, if we aren't fortified. And so we need to, when we say fortify the hosts, it certainly means that everybody should be as robust and healthy as possible, but it also means that we as a collective need to be as robust and as healthy as possible. And this whole thing that I'm going to take my own healthcare and I don't really care about somebody else's healthcare, it just doesn't make any sense, because our health, the health of all of us, is so deeply interconnected. And you look at countries like Germany that have functioning, inclusive national healthcare systems, and you look at the kind of job that they're able to do to counter this and save everybody's lives, rich people and poor people. That's why their fatality percentages are lower than ours. And so there's just a lot of insanity that we have accepted as normal. And with all of the pain and suffering that we're going through, I hope that this can be our moment where we see insanity for what it is and begin our process, not just of fixing it now, but of building a more sane future for everyone.
Well, that, Jamie, seems like a great place to stop. Thank you very much. And on that note about the interconnectedness, just a reminder to everyone who's listening that Jamie does have his piece, and I believe how to join your interconnected movement, your declaration of interdependence, on your website at jamiemetzl.com. So please do check it out. And our next call, so we're changing. We've been doing Monday, Thursday calls. Next week will be a little bit different. Our next call next week is on, I believe it's Wednesday, April 15th. I believe that's a Wednesday. And that's on, that's with Howard Friedman, and it's on the ultimate price, the value we place on life, which is actually, again, I think an extension of some of what you talked about today. And then later on in the week on Friday, we have a few of the military fellows from the Army, from the Navy, and from the Air Force, from the Council on Foreign Relations, to talk about the state of the armed forces right now. So both of those are upcoming next week. Please do join us. Please encourage friends to join as well. We're making these calls free and open to all for right now. So Jamie, thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedule to speak with us today.
It's really
stay safe.
Thank you.
Great. All right, take care. Bye-bye.